Al Capone would become America's most famous bootlegger, an odd distinction since Capone was primarily a procurer, a pimp, and, despite his fame, Capone would always be more of a legend than an influence on organized crime. He was widely regarded in his day, on both sides of the law, as a crude buffoon who ended his own career through his desire for fame and notoriety. Capone owed his celebrity to the local and eventually the national media, who were desperate to find a central point in Chicago's extremely disorganized and violent bootlegger business. The press took his garbled words and rearranged them oftentimes into witty, insightful messages and commentary on the day. In 1922, Capone, who was more or less still a procurer and part-time enforcer, was making $2,000 a week, more money than he ever dreamed he could make, but it was still a mere fraction compared to the millions that boss Johnny Torrio was piling away. Towards the end of 1927, he said he fooled away about $10 million on gambling. He tipped newsboys $5 for a newspaper and $100 to a waiter. He once bought a round of drinks in a country club speakeasy in New York for 1,000 people. He wore a pinky ring imported from South Africa worth $50,000. In 1929, his car cost $30,000 at Christmas. He spent $100,000 on miscellaneous gifts. Tourist buses stopped in front of Capone's castles, including his workplaces like the otherwise shabby Hawthorne in Cicero and the Metropole Hotel in Chicago. When he attended a prize fight, it made the sports column. The London Daily Mail sent a reporter to cover a week in the life of Al Capone and feature stories of personal glimpses of the gangsters sold for a flat $100. As his fame grew, so did his ego. Always vain, he explained the horrible scars on his face and neck, actually gotten in a knife fight in a barroom, to heroic actions in the trenches during World War I while fighting with the Lost Battalion in France. Capone never served in the military. He distributed diamond inlet belts and gave away ruby-encrusted cigarette lighters. He would outlast 4 police chiefs. He was credited with killing between 20 and 65 men himself and ordered the killing of at least 400 others and was never charged with one of them. He outlived several dozen investigations, committees, and prosecutors. There was nothing about Capone to mark him for fame and fortune. He dropped out of 6th grade after punching his teacher in the old Williamsburg section of New York. He impressed no one and was known only for being mediocre, a soft-spoken nonentity. It was commonly accepted in the underworld that Torrio was the brains in the Chicago outfit and Capone was the muscle. But Capone was clever. On January 23, 1925, Johnny Torrio, undisputed boss of the Chicago mob, stood trial for violating the Prohibition Act. Several months before, Dion O'Banion of the North Side Gangs had invited Torrio to a meeting at the Zebin Brewery, claiming that he was leaving the rackets and retiring to Colorado. He wanted Torrio to buy out his final shipment of booze and the brewery itself. When Torrio arrived at the brewery, federal agents and police staged a raid and Torrio was arrested. Now O'Banion was dead. Capone, Torrio's top street general, had the other gangs on the run. At the trial, Torrio played it smart. He pled guilty, thinking it safer to spend some time in the relative safety of a jail cell, while Capone and his boys settled business with the remaining O'Banions. Federal Judge Robert Cliff cooperated with Torrio's wishes by finding the little hood guilty and sentencing him to prison. However, he allowed Torrio 5 days to get his house in order before he had to begin his sentence. The next day, Torrio and his wife spent the afternoon shopping. Since their own car was in for repairs, they borrowed Jake Guzak's Lincoln and a driver from Capone, Robert Barton. Sylvester Barton, Capone's regular driver, had been wounded in a drive-by shooting a few weeks before. At dusk, the couple returned to their expensive third-floor apartment at 7011 Clyde Avenue and began to unload packages from the trunk. And Torrio walked ahead of Barton and her husband to hold open the apartment house door. At that second, a black limo slowly drove up out of the dark and unleashed a barrage of bullets, which filled the 2 men full of holes. Torrio was hit in the jaw and ribs. Barton was hit in both legs. Seconds later, 2 men leaped out of the car and fired more shots into Torrio, one in the right arm, the other straight in his testicles, while two other gunners fired from inside the limo, shooting up what was left of Jake Guzak's Lincoln Town car. One of the shooters walked over to Torrio's body and held a .45 to his temple and pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed or it was empty. Before he could finish his work, the limo driver blasted his horn and the shooters leaped inside the car and disappeared into the night. And Torrio dragged Johnny into the lobby of the building and an ambulance was called. When the medics arrived, Torrio yelled for them to cut off the circulation in the areas where he had been hit because he was convinced that the killers had dipped their bullets into garlic to cause gangrene to set in faster. Although a teenage boy who had witnessed the shooting later claimed that Bugs Moran was the shooter whose gun jammed over Torrio's temple, the police picked Bugs up for questioning but let him go because he could account for his whereabouts. No matter what the witnesses may have said, New York's mobster Lucky Luciano and a lot of other people figured that Capone was behind the try on Torrio's life to get him out of the way. "I know Al was behind the try at Torrio," Lucky said. "He tried to eliminate Johnny the same way Johnny done with Colosimo." After Capone overthrew Torrio, he proved to be more than just the gorilla that most gang leaders pegged him to be, and, for what he lacked in intelligence and education, his underlying provided. Capone's criminal empire included the ownership of breweries, distilleries, speakeasies, warehouses, fleets of boats and trucks, nightclubs, gambling houses, horse and dog tracks, brothels, labor unions, hundreds of private businesses. He employed at least 500 full-time goons, 1/3 of the Chicago Police Department, and several thousand other employees. His gross income was an estimated $105 million for the year, at a time when a middle-class American family got by, and very well, on less than $8,000. That was in 1927. By 1933, it was all gone and Al Capone was nothing more than a number in the federal prison system. He died broke and powerless 12 years later. In Atlanta prison in 1936, Al Capone told Red Rudensky, a burglar, "Uncle Sam got me on a bookkeeping rap. Ain't that the best?" He would, Rudensky wrote, roar with a choke and cough with laughter, but not for long, as reality would strangle his humor. Then Capone would say, "Rusty, if I could just go for a walk. If I could just look at buildings again, and smell that Lake Michigan, I'd give $1 million. Capone was resented, even hated in prison. Kidnapper and bank robber Alvin Karpis wrote, "The majority of the population in any prison is made up of losers from the gutter of society. Most of them aren't even wanted at their own homes when they are released. They resent anyone who has had prosperity on the outside." Jimmy Lucas was one of those inmates. Surly and mean, Lucas worked at the Alcatraz barbershop with Capone and wanted to make a name for himself. One day while Capone was practicing his banjo, Lucas slipped up behind him and shoved a pair of shears into Capone's back. Capone grunted deeply in pain, stood up with the shears still sticking out of his back, turned and picked Lucas up and smashed him face first into the pillar before he collapsed in pain from the superficial wound. Karpis wrote, "In Alcatraz, he's a fish out of water. He knows nothing of prison life. For example, he is allowed to subscribe to various magazines, and, like other prisoners, he is permitted to send magazines to other inmates after he reads them." Ironically, Capone, who gave orders to eliminate hundreds of lives, is now confined to rubbing out names on his magazine list when he becomes displeased or annoyed with fellow cons. It's kind of sad, I conclude. Capone had contracted syphilis in or about 1927, something he knew but failed to treat. When prison doctors finally began to treat Capone's syphilis, it was too late to correct the damage that was done to his body. With his nervous system infected by the disease, he was slowly losing his kind. But even before then, Capone was, said other inmates, losing his mind, talking about connected people in Washington who would pull strings to get him released. He said that he had paid $20,000 in bribes already. It may not have been all babble. In 1939, the wife of well-connected Chicago gangster Gus Winkler told the FBI that some of Capone's friends in the organization were trying to get him released before Frank Nitti, the boss who followed Capone, ended their efforts. Capone was released to the care of his wife on November 7, 1939, and spent his freedom on his estate in Palm Island, Florida, reading newspapers, his brother Ralph reported, and walking the grounds to get some sunshine. He spent his summers at a retreat in Mercer, Wisconsin, where brother Ralph had retired and opened a barroom. Otherwise, Capone kept out of the limelight and enjoyed his freedom. He made a brief appearance in 1941 when his son, Sonny, married a Florida society woman. The press, perhaps in a moment of nostalgic bliss, wrote one glowing story after another for Capone in January of 1942 when Capone offered his services to the war effort in any capacity to aid the national defense. The government never called him back, but his famous armored car was helping the British war effort in 1942, being driven around to fairs and carnivals to raise cash for its new owner and the Queen's government. In July of 1942, the Treasury Department sued Capone in federal court and demanded payment of back taxes totaling $250,000, which the government claimed Capone made during Prohibition, selling 19,984 bottles of beer between 1921 and 1922. They were probably wrong about the dates, since at that point Capone was still a low-level operative in the Torrio organization. But the government was relentless anyway. Prosecutors were sure Capone had tucked away at least $25 million, his fortune. But insiders later said that Capone had perhaps $5,000 left, and before he died most that was spent or given away to his son. In the end, the tax people settled for $30,000 on January 25, 1947. Capone died in his $8 million, heavily mortgaged mansion in Florida. He had suffered an apoplectic seizure and then contracted pneumonia. Remarkably, he was only 52 years old. With him at the last moments were his ever-faithful wife, May, his son, his mother, and 3 of his brothers, Ralph, Matt, and John. He was buried in Chicago's Mount Olivet Cemetery on a bitter cold day. His coffin was draped in orchards. Although a dozen of the old-time bosses that had known Capone in his prime were allowed to attend the burial, Chicago ruling boss, Tony Accardo, forbade a large turnout, saying, "I don't want this thing turning into a goddamn circus." Capone's wife and son, with all of their money gone, spent their last days living off of the goodwill of mob boss Paul Ricca.